Today is day one for the Come Follow Me study for this week, July 21st through the 27th. Where much is given, much is required. Doctrine and Covenants 81 through 83. Monday, July 21st, 2025. Doctrine and Covenants 81, 1 through 2. Help your children receive their own inspiration. Teaching means more than just sharing truth. It means helping other people become independent learners. Instead of simply telling your children how they can serve others, for example, encourage them to seek the Lord's guidance to know who they can help. On March 8, 1832, the prophet Joseph Smith called Jesse Gause and Sidney Rigdon to serve as his counselors in the presidency of the high priesthood. On March 15, 1832, the prophet received the revelation recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 81, in which the Lord clarified Brother Gause's duties as a counselor to Joseph Smith. However, Jesse Gause did not remain faithful, and the Lord later called Frederick G. Williams, whose name now appears in Doctrine and Covenants 81, to take Brother Gause's place in the presidency. Brother Williams's name replaced Brother Gause's name in the revelation. That may seem like a minor detail, but it implies a significant truth. Most revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants are addressed to specific people, but we can always seek ways to apply them to ourselves. When we read the Lord's counsel to Frederick G. Williams to strengthen the feeble knees, we can think of people we might strengthen. When we read the Lord's invitation to members of the United Firm to bind ourselves by this covenant, we can think of our own covenants. And we can read his promise, I am bound when ye do what I say, as if he's speaking to us. We can do this because, as the Lord declared, what I say unto one, I say unto all. In April 1832, Joseph Smith and other travelers to Independence, Missouri, obeyed the Lord's command to establish an organization to build up Zion and care for the poor. While there, the prophet received two revelations. On April 26, during a council of high priests and elders of the church in Independence, the prophet received the revelation recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 82, in which the Lord forgave these brethren their trespasses and warned them against further sin. He also instructed members of the United Firm to bind themselves by covenant to manage the temporal affairs of Zion. 4 days later, Joseph Smith received the revelation recorded in Doctrine and Covenants 83, in which the Lord gave instructions about the care of widows, orphans, and the poor. January 25, 1832, Joseph Smith was ordained as president of the high priesthood in Amherst, Ohio. March 8, 1832, Joseph Smith appointed Sidney Rigdon and Jesse Gause as his counselors in the presidency of the high priesthood. March 15, 1832, Doctrine and Covenants 81 was received. March 24th through the 25th, 1832, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were taken in the night and violently beaten by a mob in Hiram, Ohio. March 29th, 1832, Joseph Murdoch Smith, adopted son of Joseph and Emma Smith, died. April 1st through the 24th, 1832, Joseph Smith and other leaders traveled to Independence, Missouri. April 26, 1832, Doctrine and Covenants 82 was received. April 30th, 1832, Doctrine and Covenants 83 was received. May through June 1832, Joseph Smith stayed with Newell K. Whitney for several weeks in Greenville, Indiana. Newell had broken his foot and leg while jumping from a runaway stagecoach on his return trip to Ohio. Section 81. The Call of Frederick G. Williams. Elder B.H. Roberts said, "It has been said that there was no first presidency in the Church of Jesus Christ in former days, and that this body is peculiar to the dispensation of the fullness of times. Here the Lord declares that the keys of the kingdom belong always unto the presidency of the high priesthood. In other words, they belong to the presidency of the church." In a discourse delivered July 2nd, 1839, the prophet Joseph Smith said that Adam held the keys of the first presidency. Then Noah also held this office. He said, "The priesthood is everlasting." The Savior, Moses, and Elias gave the keys to Peter, James, and John on the mount when they were transfigured before him. This being true, then Peter, James, and John were chosen by the Lord as a first presidency and served in that capacity in the Church of Jesus Christ in their dispensation. It was by virtue of this calling that they were sent to confer upon Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery the keys of the kingdom. Elder Orson F. Whitney said the original offices of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are elder, priest, teacher, and deacon, all, except elder, callings in the Aaronic priesthood. Other offices pertaining to the priesthood of Melchizedek were evolved as fast as they became necessary. For instance, the first bishops were ordained in 1831, nearly a year after the church was organized. There was no first presidency until 1832, and no stake organization until 1834. The 12 apostles were not chosen until 1835, nor the first quorums of the 70. But all these offices and callings were inherent in the priesthood, conferred upon Joseph Smith before the church had any organization at all. They who find fault with the church, as some who have left it do, on the ground that the Lord organized it with elders, priests, teachers, and deacons, and that men have added such titles and dignities as high priest, president, patriarch, etc., would be no more inconsistent were they to criticize a human being for not remaining a child, for growing up to manhood or womanhood, and fulfilling their measure of creation. At a church conference held on January 25, 1832, in Amherst, Ohio, the prophet Joseph Smith was ordained as the president of the high priesthood by Sidney Rigdon. Gradually, the presidency of the high priesthood began to be known as the first presidency. This revelation should be regarded as a step toward the formal organization of the first presidency. Beginning in February 1834, the Lord referred to these offices as the first presidency. The use of first presidency in Doctrine and Covenants 68, 15, and 22 through 23 was added to the original revelation later. On the 15th of March, 1832, the prophet Joseph Smith received a revelation calling Frederick G. Williams to be a counselor in the first presidency of the church. Originally, however, this revelation was directed to Jesse Gauss. On March 8, 1832, he selected Sidney Rigdon and Jesse Gauss as counselors in the presidency of the high priesthood. The revelation given on March 15, 1832, confirmed Jesse Gauss's call and instructed him regarding the duties of a counselor. Jesse Gauss was likely baptized in late 1831 or early 1832. In March 1832, after being appointed as a counselor in the presidency of the high priesthood, Jesse may have assisted for a time as a scribe, while the prophet Joseph Smith continued his inspired translation of the New Testament. He also traveled with Joseph Smith and other church leaders to Independence, Missouri in April 1832. Our earliest reference to Jesse Gauss is as a member of the Shaker communities in Hancock, near Pittsfield, and possibly in North Union, Ohio as well. His conversion and baptism are not found in any of the records of the church, but one writer has suggested that he was converted by Reynolds Calhoun in late 1830. It was not until the 8th of March, 1832, when Jesse Gauss was called to be a counselor to Joseph Smith in the presidency of the high priesthood, that his name was even mentioned in surviving church records. The notation in the Kirtland Revelation book is as follows: March 8, 1832, chose this day and ordained Brother Jesse Gauss and Brother Sidney to be my counselors of the ministry of the presidency of the high priesthood. 1 week later, a revelation concerning Jesse Gauss was received by Joseph Smith, confirming Jesse in his work and giving further direction in his office and calling. There are 2 manuscript copies of this revelation extant. In both of these, Jesse Gauss's name has been crossed out and Frederick G. Williams's name written above it. Since that time, all published copies of this revelation, Section 81 of the Doctrine and Covenants, list Frederick G. Williams as the one to whom it is directed. Since this revelation contains instructions, duties, and promised blessings to the one called as counselor to the prophet, the revelation was just as appropriate for Frederick G. Williams as it was to Jesse Gauss. After Jesse Gauss was ordained, he appeared in a leading role in the church for only a short time. In April 1832, he accompanied Joseph Smith, Newell K. Whitney, and Peter Whitmer, Jr. on a trip to Missouri. They arrived the 24th of April and began holding conferences with the saints in Zion on the 26th. In the minutes of a meeting of the literary firm held on Monday, the 30th of April, Jesse Gauss was listed as a counselor to Joseph Smith. Upon his return to Kirtland, Jesse was called to serve a mission with Zebedee Coltrane. They began their journey on the 1st of August, 1832, and traveled until the 19th, at which time Coltrane decided to return to Kirtland because of severe pains in his head. After praying with and for each other, they parted. Jesse Gauss continued east and walked right out of the history of the church, never again to return. There appears to be no other record of the man either in or out of the church. Some months after the departure of Jesse Gauss, the presidency of the high priesthood was reorganized with Frederick G. Williams replacing him as counselor. This reorganization was commanded in Section 90 of the Doctrine and Covenants and actually took place on the 18th of March, 1833. Little is known about Jesse Gauss after August 1832, except that he did not remain faithful and was excommunicated on December 3, 1832. In January 1833, a few weeks after Jesse Gauss was excommunicated, the Lord called Frederick G. Williams to replace him as a counselor. Frederick G. Williams had become a member of the church after hearing the message of the missionaries who had traveled from New York to the Kirtland, Ohio area in October 1830. He had volunteered to accompany Oliver Cowdery and the other missionaries as they continued to Missouri to preach the gospel on the borders of the Lamanites. He returned to Kirtland many months later and was ordained a high priest on October 25, 1831. He later became a clerk and a scribe for Joseph Smith. Sometime after he replaced Jesse Gauss as a counselor in the presidency of the high priesthood, Frederick G. Williams's name was written into the transcription of this revelation, replacing references to Jesse Gauss. When this revelation was published in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, it referred only to Frederick G. Williams, illustrating that the instructions related to the duties of a counselor were to be applied to others, not just to Jesse Gauss. The prophet Joseph Smith said, "Brother Frederick G. Williams is one of those men in whom I place the greatest confidence and trust. For I have found him ever full of love and brotherly kindness. He is not a man of many words, but is ever winning, because of his constant mind. He shall ever have place in my heart. God grant that he may overcome all evil. Blessed be Brother Frederick, for he shall never want a friend, and his generation after him shall flourish." Section 81, Revelation given through Joseph Smith the prophet at Hiram, Ohio, March 15, 1832. Frederick G. Williams is called to be a high priest and a counselor in the presidency of the high priesthood. The historical records show that when this revelation was received in March 1832, it called Jesse Gauss to the office of counselor to Joseph Smith in the presidency. However, when he failed to continue in a manner consistent with his appointment, the call was subsequently transferred to Frederick G. Williams. The revelation, dated March 1832, should be regarded as a step toward the formal organization of the first presidency, specifically calling for the office of counselor in that body and explaining the dignity of the appointment. Brother Gauss served for a time, but was excommunicated from the church in December 1832. Brother Williams was ordained to the specified office on March 18, 1833. Read Doctrine and Covenants 81, looking for some of the responsibilities of a counselor to the first presidency. Consider all of the positions in a typical ward or branch organization that church members hold. As you study Doctrine and Covenants 81, look for principles that can help members serve successfully in their callings. The keys of the kingdom are always held by the first presidency. Doctrine and Covenants 81:1. Verily, verily, I say unto you, my servant Frederick G. Williams, listen to the voice of him who speaketh, to the word of the Lord your God, and hearken to the calling wherewith you are called, even to be a high priest in my church, and a counselor unto my servant Joseph Smith, Jr. In November 1831, the Lord revealed the principles pertaining to the organization of the first presidency. These principles were not formally presented until the 28th of March, 1835. when the newly formed Quorum of the 12 requested written instructions concerning their duties. This reply, now Section 107 of the Doctrine and Covenants, includes the items given earlier concerning the first presidency. The prophet Joseph Smith was ordained as president of the high priesthood on the 25th of January, 1832, but he did not select his counselors until the 8th of March, 1832. This revelation was directed to one of his counselors, Jesse Gauss, but it was applied to Frederick G. Williams when he was called to the presidency to replace Gauss on the 8th of March, 1833. March 18th, 1833 is the date when the organizing and ordaining of the first presidency in this dispensation was completed. These events illustrate how the church grew and developed as the need arose. President Anthon H. Lund explained, "When the church was organized on the 6th day of April, 1830, it was impossible to establish this perfect organization of the priesthood. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery were called and ordained apostles. But there could not be 12 apostles, there could not be 70, for at that time the church was too small. It took time for the work to grow. But the Lord had given revelation upon the subject, and when the proper time came, the presidency of the church was organized, with the prophet Joseph as president and Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams as his counselors. Afterwards, the 12 apostles were chosen, and then the 70s. But in the beginning, when there were not enough to form these different quorums, the elders presided, because they held the Melchizedek priesthood. The Lord, however, had a perfect organization for his church, and he gave it to them when they were ready to receive it." The prophet Joseph Smith appointed 2 counselors in the presidency of the high priesthood. This pattern continues to be followed today, although there have been times when the president of the church has appointed 1 or more additional counselors. The president of the church and his 2 counselors form a presidency, allowing them to preside over the membership of the church. President Gordon B. Hinckley explained the role of counselors. "The counselors are not the president. In certain circumstances, they may act in his behalf, but this is a delegated authority. A counselor is an assistant to the president. Regardless of the organization, the assistant of president is a heavy and burdensome one. As an assistant, the counselor is not the president. He does not assume responsibility and move out ahead of his president. In presidency meetings, each counselor is free to speak his mind on all issues that come before the presidency. However, it is the prerogative of the president to make the decision, and it is the duty of the counselors to back him in that decision. His decision then becomes their decision, regardless of their previous ideas. Even the president of the church, who is prophet, seer, and revelator, and whose right and responsibility it is to make judgment and direct the course of the church, invariably consults with his counselors to determine their feelings. If there is a lack of unity, there follows an absence of action. 2 counselors working with the president preserve a wonderful system of checks and balances. They become a safeguard that is seldom, if ever, in error and affords great strength of leadership. Doctrine and Covenants 81:2. "Unto whom I have given the keys of the kingdom, which belong always unto the presidency of the high priesthood." Soon after the saints began gathering to Ohio, a special conference was held June 3rd through the 6th, 1831, for those who had previously been ordained as elders. At that conference, the first high priests were ordained. For a time, early members of the church referred to the office of high priest as the high priesthood. Over time, the use of the term high priesthood was understood to mean the Melchizedek priesthood. In 1902, the first presidency quoted the scripture passage stating that the president of the high priesthood of the church is the presiding high priest over the high priesthood of the church, and then declared, "It is well to remember that the term high priesthood is frequently used as reference to the Melchizedek priesthood, in contradistinction to the lesser or Aaronic priesthood." The Lord had previously referred to Joseph Smith as an apostle and the first elder of the church, and as a seer, translator, and prophet. The ordination of Joseph Smith as president of the high priesthood on January 25th, 1832, further defined his presiding role in the Melchizedek priesthood of the church. In the revelation given originally to Jesse Gauss and later assigned to Frederick G. Williams, the Lord explained that the keys of the kingdom belong always unto the presidency of the high priesthood, further clarifying the sacred and distinguished role of the president of the church and his counselors. The keys of the kingdom mentioned in Doctrine and Covenants 81:2 refer to the authority to direct the church and govern the use of the priesthood. President Joseph F. Smith explained, "The priesthood in general is the authority given to man to act for God. Every man that has been ordained to any degree of the priesthood has this authority dedicated to him. But it is necessary that every act performed under this authority shall be done at the proper time and place, in the proper way, and after the proper order. The power of directing these labors constitute the keys of the priesthood. In their fullness, these keys are held by only one person at a time, the prophet and president of the church. He may delegate any position of this power to another, in which case that person holds the keys of that particular labor. Thus, the president of a temple, the president of a stake, the bishop of a ward, the president of a mission, the president of a quorum, each holds the keys of the labors performed in that particular body or locality. This priesthood is not increased by this spiritual appointment. For a 70 who presides over a mission has no more priesthood than a 70 who labors under his direction. And the president of an elders' quorum, for example, has no more priesthood than any member of that quorum. But he holds the power of directing the official labors performed in the mission or the quorum, or in other words, the keys of that division of that work. So it is throughout all the ramifications of the priesthood. A distinction must be carefully made between the general authority and the directing of the labors performed by that authority. President Joseph Fielding Smith added, "These keys are the right of presidency. They are the power and authority to govern and direct all of the Lord's affairs on earth. Those who hold them have power to govern and control the manner in which all others may serve in the priesthood. All of us men may hold the priesthood, but we can only use it as authorized and directed so to do by those who hold the keys. This priesthood and these keys are conferred upon Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery by Peter, James, and John, and by Moses and Elijah and others of the ancient prophets. They have been given to each man who has been set apart as a member of the Council of the 12. But since they are the right of presidency, they can only be exercised in full by the senior apostle of God on earth, who is the president of the church. May I now say very plainly and very emphatically that we have the holy priesthood, and that the keys of the kingdom of God are here. They are found only in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. By revelation to Joseph Smith, the Lord said that these keys belong always unto the presidency of the high priesthood. President Joseph Fielding Smith continued, "And also, whosoever receiveth my word receiveth me, and whosoever receiveth me receiveth those, the first presidency, whom I have sent." In this same connection, the prophet Joseph Smith said, "You must make yourselves acquainted with those men who, like Daniel, pray 3 times a day toward the house of the Lord. Look to the presidency and receive instruction." President Joseph Fielding Smith added, "Now, brethren, I think there is one thing which we should have exceedingly clear in our minds. Neither the president of the church, nor the first presidency, nor the united voice of the first presidency and the 12 will ever lead the saints astray, or send forth counsel to the world that is contrary to the mind and will of the Lord. An individual may fall by the wayside, or have views, or give counsel which falls short of what the Lord intends. But the voice of the first presidency, and the united voice of those others who hold with them the keys of the kingdom, shall always guide the saints and the world in those paths where the Lord wants them to be. I testify that if we shall look to the first presidency and follow their counsel and direction, No power on earth can stay or change our course as a church, and as individuals, we shall gain peace in this life and be inheritors of eternal glory in the world to come.